one example of maybe a more progressive view of nostalgia is the renewed interest in vinyl and cassette tapes in music. Now, while it's true that vinyl is the most high fidelity copy of pre-digital recordings, meaning that if you have a master copy of some, I don't know, song from the 60s, the master copy is the vinyl, so you only have the vinyl to go by, and a digital sort of copy of the vinyl is a step removed from the original. But with the kind of exception of that, it actually presents a degradation in sound quality if the master recording is digital and then it is copied onto vinyl. So if you have like the latest Taylor Swift, I don't think Taylor Swift circulates her stuff via vinyl, but, or, you know, Lady Gaga, I know that she does. So Lady Gaga's latest album, and it's digital recording, and then you send that to a factory and then you make a vinyl copy of it, then the vinyl copy is, you know, actually a step removed from the sort of master copy. So why the culture of vinyl when for the most part it is a sort of degradation in sound quality? So in order to answer that, we have to look at the transformation that has occurred in music culture recently. So much like my arguments about nostalgia processing our kind of views and experiences of current media technology through the past, what I would argue is that if you are trying to nostalgically kind of recreate an instrument of the past, you should look at what people are uncertain about in the present in order to use that past example to help people process what they're going through in terms of media change in the present. So recent changes in music culture, we see the rise of streaming services in places of tangible objects like CDs. We see the disappearance of the potency of the album in favor of singles. We see a desire of immediate access to music in all kinds of spatial contexts. So people want ready access to music everywhere. So in many ways, the vinyl record challenges these aspects of contemporary music culture, or responds to them. So the vinyl record is a very tactile object. It consists of, much like the first gramophones, it consists of sort of like a series of grooves in vinyl. And then a needle, you drop a needle onto it and it reads the grooves, and then this is sort of like circulated to amplifiers, and then you hear the music. You can argue it is an indexical sort of form of media, meaning that in order to record it in the first place, you need to originally you needed someone to kind of sing into kind of an amplifier, and then that, move a needle and make the grooves to begin with. So the sort of the media format has a physical relationship to the source of the media. Okay. Whoa, let's backtrack. So tangent on indexicality, which I think might interest some of you. Roland Barthes was a French theorist who looked a lot at photography, and he argued that part of what made photography very unique is that it was indexical, meaning that you have a camera set up and you have the object that you want to photograph, and the celluloid camera sort of takes the photo by light bouncing off of the object and then back into the camera, and in making a kind of a mark in that film, that you have some control with shutter speed and f-stop and other kind of elements of the camera, but for the most part, light bounces off the object and into the camera and makes a imprint in that film. So the film itself and the image has a physical relationship to the object because of the light bouncing off of it. It's almost like a death mask, or any kind of mold, like a mold of a face, or physical object. And he said that, so photography has an intensely physical relationship to the object, which is not something you usually think about. And you could kind of argue the same thing about digital photography, that it's still light bouncing off an object and into a camera that is sort of recording the object in terms of sort of pixels and sort of binary values. So it's interesting stuff, and a lot of nostalgic media has this property of intense indexicality that we seem to feel like we're losing at the moment, that the media we use are not as physically sort of present and attached to what they consume, that by taking multiple selfies, you lose some sort of relationship with the thing that you're photographing at a certain point, and it becomes all about the image and less about the relationship of the image to the object. So vinyl is one of those media that is indexical because it has a physical imprint in sort of a medium, and then you sort of read that sort of imprint in order to reproduce it. Okay, so brief aside in terms of indexicality that might be of interest to some of you. What else defines vinyl media? So it's a tactile object. It consists of grooves. It's indexical. It comes in a sleeve with packaging and artwork. They even offer artistic statements or manifestos. The 1980 band, The Return of the Dirty Column, made their sleeves out of sandpaper. And so the sleeve is the kind of thing that the record comes in. It's kind of like an envelope. And so they made them out of sandpaper. So when you bought it and you took the vinyl record out of it, it destroyed it by taking it back because it grated against the sandpaper. So that's a kind of artistic statement, kind of a mean one, but that's an artistic statement that has to do with the tactility of the vinyl record. It's sort of like a Banksy like move, if you're familiar with the graffiti artist or the artist Banksy. So records would have what Benjamin might call aura. And just to harken back to what we kind of talked about back then, but Benjamin was talking about how reproducible media lacked aura, because what an erratic experience is actually standing in front of a mountain, not a kind of, or standing in front of a painting, not experiencing a photograph of the mountain or painting, because that can be endlessly reproducible. But I think you can argue that records have an aura because of this idea of tactility, and because they're so you handle them, they have a touch, they have a feel a smell, a specialness that can't be captured by a Spotify playlist, right? They also engage a very different kind of experience, musically speaking, since you have to, put the record on the kind of player and then drop the needle very lightly. And then once that side is done, you have to flip the record. And I always find flipping records have through a huge, like my friends who have record players, and they're like, okay, who wants to flip the record? I'm like, I don't want to flip the record. Like, Jesus, we just had, it's like half an album and someone has to go and flip it. Like, I'm more lazy in that way. And that's why I prefer kind of the streaming services. But for a lot of people, the kind of physical embodied experience of going and flipping the record and then dropping the needle again is a part of the whole nostalgic experience. So it privileges an attention to the album rather than individual songs, since dropping the needle on individual songs is kind of a skill in and of itself and not something everyone can do. So there's also other practices associated with vinyl, like record owners might engage in something called crate digging, which is going to large record stores and flipping through the records to discover something that is valuable or not priced accordingly, so down priced, or something that is unknown or might be interesting. So all of these are nostalgic responses to the age of streamed music. And they're not necessarily regressive. In fact, vinyl might be a way of processing the changes that we have seen. And many vinyl owners also have Spotify accounts and use both for different purposes. So it's worth asking what purposes your nostalgic media might serve. And many of you are already kind of asking these questions in your projects, which is good. So the reason why, let me take a drink of water. Cassette tapes. The reason why cassette tapes have come back is that when you go to someone's show and buy what is essentially a download code, the artist wants you to take away something that is material. That is kind of, something you could hold in your hand and put on your shelf and collect. It's a collectible item. In terms of the collection, so Susan Stewart thinks, much like Jameson, that the collection basically aims to tame history by displacing history with a system of classification, by abstracting history and supplicating it to the collector's system of organization. The collection is also about aestheticizing the object and removing it from its use value. So in terms of the cassette tape, you're probably not going to use it, because who has a cassette player at this point? So it becomes a collectible item that you put on your shelf and you use the download code to kind of have the digital copy. Another example is if I have a coin collection. I'm probably really prematurely old, but hypothetically, if I had a coin collection, I'm removing those coins from their literal circulation as currency and transforming them into aesthetic objects. So the collection is also hermetically sealed off from the world. The collection is therefore about control and controlling history, of taming, abstracting, and removing it from the narrative of history. So this is a less forgiving idea about nostalgia and the collection that I'm applying to the cassette tape. You might agree that the collection that you have is about a sensation of control for you, control over your history or your life story perhaps, or if you want to entertain the more progressive views of nostalgia, you might kind of look at that collection and sort of say, actually, this is helping me process my past and process my present. Like this is a nostalgic collection that is aiding me in sort of greeting historical change and personal change. Let's return to some of the case studies that we did earlier and see if we can't apply this different, more forgiving nostalgic framework. So we looked at my 98-year-old Nana, poor Nana, and thought, wow, she's repressing memories of the Great Depression that were definitely not fun. Another way of looking at her nostalgia is that she's framing a negative experience within the overarching narrative of her life to understand what she learned from that experience and what she kept from it. Many of our most painful memories are interlocked with a bittersweetness, with fondness, with nostalgia for aspects of them. And this might be a way of processing pain at a fundamental level. Nostalgia might be an emotional process that can be positive. So let's take the Rockabilly Girls of 10 years ago. So from Jameson's perspective, fashion stagnated and thus relied on the past in order to move forward at all. Another perspective is that women were reappropriating this aesthetic that was associated with pre-feminism, with a time when women were homemakers, and they are mapping this aesthetic onto girl power in order to re-script its meaning. So nostalgia can therefore be recuperative in a gendered way. So all the sort of borrowings from the past that were the kind of, aesthetics of the 1950s and 60s and women's hair and makeup and dress were ways of sort of looking at pre-feminist times and making them have meaning by placing them in the contemporary sort of context in order to better see the progress that we've made between then and now. So that's what I would argue. Let's revisit Tarantino again. We gave Tarantino a hard time last video. So yes, you can accuse him of superficially invoking the past because it looks cool. But if you turn to more recent works like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Inglourious Bastards, these are intensely aware of history and the possibilities of re-narrativizing those histories in order to serve a sort of palliative effect, like a healing effect. So spoiler alert, fast forward this 10 seconds or so. In one film, he recreates a past in which Hitler dies, and in the other, he recreates one in which the Manson family murders never happened. So in both films, which heavily stylize their times, nostalgia is used to revise history and to re-script it in potentially healing ways that kind of make people think about the past critically. Now, the more challenging case study I had to apply this progressive idea of nostalgia was Make America Great Again campaign for Trump and its reliance on a nostalgia for post-war American prosperity. So perhaps this is a restorative nostalgic example where people want to recreate the time in all of its aspects. But it exists within a larger culture where histories are returning to the past in order to either argue for the restoration of these cultures or re-examine these pasts in order to better move forward. And my feeling is, in terms of the Trump campaign, that it does want to recreate the past wholesale. You could argue that it is nostalgically looking at the past in order to move forward in a critical way that doesn't seek to recreate the past, but that seeks to use it as a sounding board, or sort of some sort of or beacon for better navigating the present and conceiving of a future. So that's one way of applying a more forgiving, nostalgic framework to the Trump political rhetoric. So the ways that this week applies to your projects is multifold. You might ask if your project falls into restorative or recuperative nostalgic framework. Do you agree with Jameson in the deterioration of culture that can't make new memories? And if so, how might this be reflected in your project? Do you want your nostalgic medium to encourage a re-narrativization of personal histories, thereby encouraging people to reflect on the flexibility and mutability of history itself? In other words, if we are aware that our own self-narratives are flexible and ever-changing, then we should logically look at the way we tell history as equally flexible and open to interpretation through representation. So those are the kind of main questions I would be asking this week. And I look forward to seeing you in tutorial. Bye.